I'm Steve Peterson. I think most people know me but have been coming. If you don't, let's chat down after the networking. I started this program, this special interest group with Dan McCurry and with Arun Bachu. He's a VP analyst over at in AI over at Gartner, and Michael O'Rufo. He's leading the Gen AI over at Boston Scientific. And so the four of us put it together, and we're lucky enough to have a CAF member. Now, what CAF is a chief architect forum. And so we have people that have been chief architects throughout the world. It's really international. And there's some criteria. You had to run a practice at a Fortune 500 company, and you had to be a chief architect at some point, maybe. So some other criteria, but if you're an architect and you're interested in that, let us know, and we can certainly connect you. The Chief Architect Forum is also providing a lot of our speakers, right? Just as us, that connection. So Jim Wilt back here was one of our star presenters. He's with the Chief Architect Forum, as I am. And Michael had presented with prompt engineering, and Stephen Kaufman also is. So our speaker is Stephen Kaufman. You probably saw his write-up. And he's a chief architect over at Microsoft in customer success, right? Yes. And so one of our power architects in the city, is we have so many, so it's really fun. We got a great topic here, LLMOps. So I'll let him get started. And after, we'll have that networking downstairs. So feel free to connect with everybody. It's a networking event. And so let's make sure that everybody connects together. All right?
Fantastic. Thank you. So it's a nice group, and it is a huge topic. We're not going to cover everything because it's just too big. So we're going to kind of go across the surface of a lot of different things. If there are questions or things during, raise your hand. Let's speak up. Doesn't just have to be one way. Okay? So with that, let's talk about LLM ops. But the best part is I have to make sure that my computer is actually working. So where is the best place to talk about LLM ops? Let's go back a bit and talk about DevOps. We're all doing DevOps, right? Hopefully, hopefully I'm seeing heads that aren't moving and I'm getting scared. But everybody's doing DevOps. Everybody knows that, okay, these are all of the parts that we're looking at, and we think about continuous planning, integration, delivery, operations, quality, security, collaboration. We're all agreed with this, right? We're all,
yes.
Okay. Again, I'm gonna look for feedback. So if this is everything that we're doing today, why do we need something special for LLM ops? Why doesn't it just fit into this? Or does it fit into this? Does it? Doesn't it? Does? Kind of. Okay. I don't know who just said that, but that was a great plant. Okay. So part of the issue is, and this is going to be a build slide, so I'm just going to let this go, because part of the issue is that just like in DevOps, we have a lot of people that are doing a lot of things, touching a lot of areas, that are taking on different roles. Now, some of those roles in here are going to be the same people that we've had in those roles for years. And now we're introducing a large language model, or we're introducing AI, or we're trying to augment or change or add something new. Right? So now we might have different roles than what we typically had in the past, where we might have had somebody doing quality and testing. And we had that going pretty well, right? We had our test scenarios. We had all the activities around testing. And then we introduced this thing called a large language model. And how do you test a large language model? How do you test what comes out of it? How do you test the prompt of what goes in it? So now that role changes. The person that this person was working with changes, right? So we've got those types of changes. Now we still have all of the things that we do in the middle. right? We're still trying to figure out what our requirements are. We're still trying to figure out, okay, how do we create tasks? Who's going to do those tasks? What are the things that we need to be doing to get the solution into production? And by the way, do we all agree that that's our goal? Our goal is to build something and get it into production, right? Okay, again, I'm making sure, because I come to this with certain assumptions, and sometimes it's just a proof of concept, and that's okay. A lot of times it starts with a proof of concept that may or may not ever go to production. Now, I still might have to do some of these things. But what I want to talk about today is how do we get it to production? So when I'm working through all of this, we've got to plan and track just as we do. I've got to develop something. I've got to build and deploy something. I have to test. Maybe not in this order. Maybe testing should come before deploy. Okay, I'm glad I got some laughs. I know that there are people in this room that have stories of deploying and then testing. I think we all do. So with this, we're comfortable with this, right? We all know this. But now let's change it. Okay, let's augment it. Let's add to it. But what do we add to it? So now what we get into is this. And it's an overlay. We're still doing the same things that we did before. We're just changing it a little bit, right? Because now we have different roles than we may have had in the past. We may have been doing different tasks, right? So if I start here, and I'm just going to go real quickly because we're going to go into each of these in depth. But if I start here with exploring, ideation, what am I building? Right? That's the first part that we have to figure out. How do I interact with the large language model? What large language model? I mean, let's talk about that for a second. Are we using GPT-3, 3.5, 4 turbo, 4.5 turbo? Which large language model? Or are we not? Are we using Llama? Are we using... Exactly, that was just announced. 5.3, small language models. There are lots of them. So how do we find the right one? And part of that is going to come down to, is it accuracy? Is it cost? Is it latency? Is it platform? Right? I might be using a platform where I only have certain options of certain large language models. That might drive a decision. So I have to figure out which large language model. Then I'm going to write some prompts. Now I say we're going to write some prompts. How many people are interacting with large language models today for not just personal, but also for work? Okay. And how many people write a prompt and get a response back and only write one prompt? Or do you write multiple prompts and you see which one is giving you a better result? Oh, fantastic. Okay, that's good. Four different LLMs. Fantastic.
But it makes it difficult because you want to automate, you know how to evaluate the outputs.
Stephen, could you repeat the questions?
Yes, yes. So one of the comment was testing it against 4 LLMs. And the idea is that you're going to get different answers. You might get some hallucinations. You might get some bias. And so as you test, you're going to be able to see which one is doing which. I'm always interested, somewhat surprised, when I talk to people and they say, no, we only create one prompt. Everything that we need to do, we put into that one prompt, and we get the response back, and then we go with it. We don't want to do that. That is not a best practice. It's fast. It might be efficient, but not the best process. Okay, so then we actually have to go do some things. We have a prompt. We have to go do some things as we build. And so that might be that we're fine-tuning the model. It might be that we're fine-tuning our prompts. It might be that we're doing the RAG pattern, right? Retrieval augmented generation, where I'm essentially grounding the model with my data. So that has kind of been everywhere now, right? Everybody's familiar with RAG. Okay, I'll go into it a little bit more because that kind of has some impacts as to how do we deploy and how do we package. I'll talk about evaluation and that kind of stuff, but when we actually get to deploy, there's a lot of things that we end up deploying. There's a lot of things that we end up having to put into the package. And a lot of times, what we see is that people are creating custom solutions to do that deployment. That takes a lot of time, error prone. In one sense, I'm happy when I see that they're doing a custom solution. There's other options. We'll get into that. But at least they're not doing it manually, right? They're not saying, okay, let's get into production and redeploy the model, and let's go deploy our code, and let's go deploy our vector database, whatever else we might be doing. Because what's the best part of DevOps? Repeatability, automation, right across the board. So the other part at the end, and again, I'll get more into this, is monitoring. How many people are monitoring their solutions today? Okay, that's really painful. I appreciate all those that raised their hand. All of you who did not raise your hand, find me at the end and let's talk over a beer, because we have to talk about monitoring. Monitoring is going to be extremely important. The other is quota and cost management, because all of us have a budget, right? Does anybody not have a budget that they're just not worried? Oh, wait, I almost saw somebody shift and raise their hand. Okay, so these all become considerations, things that we didn't necessarily maybe think about or have to plan for before. Now, maybe, yes, you might say, we still had to do monitoring, we still had to do cost. Some of you might be saying, we really didn't have to do cost because somebody else in the organization did it. But now all of a sudden with this, we do. Okay, so it's all about getting into production, right? That is our goal. That's why we're building this. We might be doing a proof of concept to test, but really the goal is that we get something into production and we are doing something for the organization. So when we go on that road to production, we know that there are things that get in our way. They always do. So part of it is, how do we pick the right large language model, for an example? I talk to a lot of people who do not move forward because what just happened with GPT-3, 3.5? It's got an end of life. So now what happens if I pick that and it takes me a few months to get into production? All of my testing is 4.5, but now do I go to 4? Do I now need to do my testing again? Do I go to 4.5? Do I wait? Or even better, what happens if I'm doing all of my vectorizing using the IASA model? And does everybody know what just got announced with the IASA model in OpenAI. End of life, right? Now we have a year, but there's no migration. So now what? Do I wait? Do I do my own conversion? Was I already in production and did I have things that were vectorized? And now I have to go and use either the new large or small text model and go do them again. So that's what getting started, why that becomes an issue. So we all know about development, context, evaluation. We're going to talk more about those. Operationalization. That one is the hardest one. That's where people struggle. Because I might have the best application and everything went well, testing went well, all of the responses went well, users are using, right? Everything is going well. And now the business gets involved. And then what happens with privacy? What happens with security? What did we deal with those? Did we not deal with those? Was the business on board? Do we know where our data is? Do we know where our data is going? Do we know where our data is being processed? Right? Those are things that get into issues. So when we think about operationalization, we think about how do we deal with this on the business side? How do we deal with it on the IT side? So on the business side, it's really about the successful delivery. They're investing. They want something out of it. They want to get into production as fast as possible. And guess what else they want? They want 100% accuracy. Right? How many of us have heard that? And they say, yeah, 100% accuracy. Right? That's what our systems have always done over history. Are we going to get 100% accuracy? Can we get 100% accuracy? Okay? So that's a conversation that we have to have. It's also an understanding, right? So that becomes important. For IT, it's about, what do I do? This is changing what we've done. How do I deal with deployment? How do I deal with the large language model? How do I deal with multiple large language models? That's an issue. The other is there is a trend that for most of us, when we started with this, we wrote a prompt to a large language model, we got a response back. We were happy. Well, then things got more complex. And are all of us prompt engineers? I'm seeing a few no's and I'm seeing a lot of people not shaking their head. So I'm going to guess that we have some prompt engineers in here. For those of us that are not prompt engineers, one of the trends now is that you're making multiple connections to the large language model. The first one is you're giving that large language model essentially prompts to build the final prompt that's going to go to the second call of the large language model. Okay, so you're using the large language model to essentially figure out what's the best prompt, or to have it create the prompt from the parameters that you're sending in. Now, that's really, really cool. It's actually kind of amazing. But how do we test it? Right? Now, I've got the system creating a prompt to send back to the system. And so now there's things there that we have to think about. So it always comes back to people, process, and platform. Always. Do we have the right people? Do we have the right people trained? Do we have the right process? Did this just break our DevOps process, or are we adding to our DevOps process? Right? What are the additional things that I have to do as part of that process? And then, of course, the platform. Now, The platform is going to drive a couple things. It's going to drive what large language models you might have available. It might also drive what tools are available, right? So that has an impact. So when we think about this, this process runs no matter what platform, right? No matter what are the processes. We might have to augment some of them. But the idea is that this idea, the same that we had in DevOps, is still exactly the same. So that part doesn't change. What does change is that I might have more tasks that I need to do. I might have different tasks that I need to do, and I might have different people that are involved. So I've got to figure out, do I have data? Now, if I'm creating my own model, that's going to have some different aspects that if I'm just coming up to a large language model and doing that, right? Doing that interaction. But so I might be creating my own model and I might have to deal with data and how do I train it and test it and all of that. I might be using the RAG pattern. And now I have to figure out, wait, I've got data that I'm going to bring into the system. What data do I include? How do I version that data? How am I going to index that data? And am I going to index it? Am I going to create a vector index, or am I going to put it into a vector database? Am I going to chunk that data? Is it already chunked? Do I have a different service that does that? Right, so I've got some things here that start to come into the picture. And then I've got people who are doing that. Now, it might be that we wear multiple hats. And so some of us are doing a whole bunch of different things here. But the other is now whether I'm building and training or I'm figuring out how all of this works before deployment, right? Yes.
So thinking about lifecycle nodes,
Yeah.
I've always thought of it as having your own training, so deploy, manage, monitoring, finally remediation.
Yes.
So that was something you had not yet touched upon. But taking the workflow here, instead of calling it remediation, you're calling it retraining, which is appropriate for the next line.
Correct.
So it's one way to think of it.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because most of the time they don't think about what it takes to fix it.
So that, if you think about what we have been doing over all of these years, we put something into production, we find something that either needs to change or a bug or a change in requirements, whatever that is, and you still have that loop to come back and we would come out with a point version. Well, now it may not be that we're taking an entire application. It might be that we're changing the data, right? We're figuring out what is that data, what are we doing on the versioning for our RAG pattern? What are the things that we're doing where, you know what, maybe in the real world, when we're actually using the prompt, maybe it's not getting us exactly what we want. Maybe we didn't think about some of the things we should put into the system prompt to make sure that we were guiding it for the types of answers, or to tell us that, hey, you know what, if you don't know, say you don't know, don't go make something up for us, right? So back to Jim's comment about hallucinations, right? We've got to figure out how do we reduce those hallucinations. Okay. Now, yes, wait, two hands. Okay. So you have a data scientist who really truly was trained as a data scientist, statistics, and all the rest of the things that we typically know of as a data scientist. And then you've got the citizen data scientist that is part of a team where they come in, they do a little bit of the work that a data scientist does, but they're doing it for a very short amount of time. They might be doing it for one specific interaction, whatever that is. Think of it as kind of like a power user. Hold on, I'll come back to you. I think you were next in the black shirt, right?
Yeah, we noticed with our own models, RAG and all, is that just the introduction of adding machine learning into our platform changed now how people interact with our platform, which changed the data, which means we change our validation set. And so it's like this ongoing thing.
Yes.
So it's awesome.
Yes, absolutely. And that is an important aspect, because the way that you think it's going to be used before it goes into production is going to be different than what it is in production. So it's an important loop. Yes.
It was just a question for the citizen data scientist. Do you see that really as somebody from the business who really understands the data, how they use the data, how they interpret the data, or even what the data means? Because I know we would.
I would rather.
Bring in, you need that expert.
Yes.
Looking at the data, at the context.
So it's not on here, but to me, that's either a data analyst or a business analyst, right? They know what the data means, where this is a person who they might know, hey, we've got to run this model, or we've got to do this particular statistical whatever, or I'm going to chunk the data this way to do this kind of a vector to create this kind of an index because I want it to be a hybrid index, right? So it's things like that where you start to get into that level of capability. Okay, one more.
Stephen?
Lots of.
When they ask them, repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. That's what your thing is nobody online can hear? Okay, so I'm going to go kind of in order, front to back. So hold on. I don't remember who had their hand up here first.
I was going to ask, where do the prompts fit? Are they part of the prompts?
Prompts are here. Yes. Yes.
I would say that LLMOps is just a special case for the MLOps, because all these stages are valid for any model, not just large language.
That is absolutely correct. Yes. Now, MLOps has slight variations, a couple of different things that you would do that you don't necessarily need to do with LLMOps. We're not really going to get into that for this part. But yes, there's a lot of similarities that are there. Okay, Zoom question. Okay, I'm going to take the second question first because I heard all of that. And yes, I will repeat the questions. Okay, now the first question was something about how does non-deterministic okay, how does non-determinism change the approach? Maybe I'll say it this way. It changes the looping and the number of times you're going to loop. It doesn't necessarily change the approach. Right? So it's about how many times am I looping and testing and trying to figure out what are my variables, my distinctions, my different things that are going to happen. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to go through the next couple slides kind of fast because I want to make sure we get enough time to cover all of this. I've got 92, no, I don't have 92 slides. Okay, so holy moly. This is why it starts to get a little bit complex. And I'm not trying to make it complex. What I am trying to do is say, here are a lot of steps and why this gets to be so many touch points, right? We've got all kinds of people in here doing all kinds of different things. And I'm not going to get into what the roles are and what each one specifically is, because if you want, we can get into that over beer. What I do want to point out is how many of them have multiple roles that touch it, right? So from a management, an organization, a versioning, right? Just the activities that are going on. That's a lot of activities. And we're going to do a little bit of every single one of those, most likely. And so that's why LLMOps becomes so important. Now, we've got the people part of this, right? Everybody's involved, know what we're doing there. Now, your question about ML versus LLM, very timely, because now let's start talking about the data. Let's start talking about what happens as we kind of move in deeper. Now, I don't care whether it's an ML model, an LLM model. The point is, I hate build slides, so let's get this built. I've got data. I've got things I'm going to do with my data. And then what comes out of the process. So now, if we say, okay, I've got algorithms that I'm trying to build and to figure out. I've got models that I'm trying to interact with. No, I don't have to train it, but I still have to interact with it. And so we've got challenges that we have to now start to figure out. So part of this is that iteration. Testing, what are we doing with the prompts? And so part of what we have to figure out is, are we getting a hallucination? Do we know that it's a hallucination? Do we know that it's valid? Okay, so that's one thing we have to figure out. Is there bias? Is there fairness? Ethics, security. Okay, so now we're starting to get into things like responsible AI. Right, but those are the things we have to figure out. We have to figure out, are we, the people who are building the solution, are we in control of the prompt? Is there anything that's happening where they could get access and do prompt injection? Is there anything where we have created a chat interface and we've surfaced that in the UI of our application, and we let the end users type anything that they want because it's new and we can get the checkbox that says we have AI in our application. And yes, that happens. And guess what people do? Yes, I was going to say before that happens, but yes, that is an end result. So you give me a chat interface and a UI, I'm going to start typing stuff in. I'm going to start playing. I'm going to see how far I can push it. Now, what happens if I didn't think about it? What happens if I didn't put any filtering in place? What happens if I didn't look at any types of, whether it's putting filters or looking at the prompt going in or the response coming out? And am I checking for any type of violent words, any of the negatives that, well, the whole litany, and making sure that we are doing something right with this technology? Those are things that we have to make sure that we're incorporating that we didn't have to do when we were doing, a regular, let's call it a 3-tier application, right? For data entry or whatever we were going to be doing. So these things now become important. So the breadth of what we now have to do as part of our solution encompasses those activities. And now I have to make sure that I do the testing of those, and I have to make sure that those settings get set as I do my deployments.
Is Mama home? No, Mom is coming.
Okay. So,
Okay, you want the magical animal fairies?
whoops,
But
if we
it's
get
a
somebody
reading
on
book,
mute,
it's
please.
not an audio book.
Is that a hallucination or is that just wrong data?
I can play it.
What we did
I
on the
got
chat
read.
is we said, hey, what's the definition of LLMOps? Is LLMOps lifelong learning machine operations? No, that's not what it means. Now, the rest of it, great, but that's not right. So is that a hallucination or is that just wrong? Could be. No context. Okay, so All I did is I said, what is LLM ops? I didn't give it any other information. So that might be something real. It's not what we want, but it might be something real. So how do we test for that? That's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about. Okay, it's funny, but it's real. Okay, so let's go on to the middle circle. Because here is where a lot of the fun takes place. And when I say a lot of the fun, I really mean RAG, exception handling, evaluation, and testing. Right? Testing is fun. Testing is fun. Test code is as important as function code. Please, please, please. Wait, who just said that? I love it. Okay, I love it. Keep telling us that and we'll believe it. Okay. Test code is as important as, no, never mind. We're going to go on. Okay, so why is this important? Because this tends to be one of the things that every single company wants to do. They want to be able to create a solution. And I'm not going to say what, I don't care if it's a chat, I don't care if it's whatever it is. They want to be able to create a solution that uses their own data without having that data be used by the large language model for tuning, training, testing, right? The data that you bring should be your data, and it should sit alongside the large language model. So now, how do I start asking the questions? How do I start figuring out, right? We're kind of bouncing back and forth between the solution itself and how do we test it? So the solution itself, great, I'm bringing data. How do I know what data? Got to figure that out. What format is the data? Where is it coming from? Does the data, is it actually coming in as part of my app? Do I package it? And is it always the same? Right now, why am I bringing that up? Because that is part of our solution. We have to figure out, is this a package by itself? And do I have a set of PDF documents in blob storage that are always going to be those PDF files? And they're going to go from environment to environment until I get into production. And that's it. Great. I have to make sure that that gets packaged as part of the application. That is different than if I'm having data come in and we're recreating indexes at night, or we're doing flip-flops from a primary to a secondary index, and we're constantly building that secondary index throughout the day. Right? Different patterns, but that's part of what I have to figure out for the bounds of my operations, my packaging, my deployment. How do we chunk? What are we doing for vectoring, embeddings? Where do I store it? Am I using caching? Maybe. So all of these become an aspect that we have to make sure we're packaging and that we're dealing with. So I'm not going to get into RAG because I think everybody shook their head yes that they've at least heard of it. Anybody not heard of it? One person. Okay. So essentially what this lets us do is capture a certain amount of private proprietary data and incorporate that with the large language model interactions. So not with the large language model, but with the interactions. And it allows me to essentially take a prompt, ask questions, language in, don't care what language, interact with that data and the large language model, get language back. Again, doesn't matter what language, because large language model can handle many different languages. We can do that translation. Okay. So one of the big things when we're testing is how do we make sure that we ground our large language model and that we're reducing the hallucinations. So I asked before, can we get to 100% accuracy? And everybody shook their head no, which is correct. But will I always have a hallucination? Am I 100% guaranteed to have hallucinations? No, maybe 99%, 100% free of hallucinations. Don't know, but grounding your data brings that percent much, much, much higher. And that's the concept behind it. And that's why I'm talking about it in the presentation. And I'll, again, do the build out because I love build outs.
See, Stephen, how
Yes.
do you deal with,
Whoops.
one of the problems is you get different answers. Yeah, notice, or at least format.
Yes.
And how do you, even if you said, I got my scheme, I'm gonna give it a test it. Well, there's not been consistency, right? How do you deal with that?
So there's consistency in the wording. Oh, sorry, repeat the question. Sorry. I'll get it by the time we end the session.
Testing.
Yes, you were.
You're crushing it.
So the question is consistency. How do we have either consistent format or consistent wording of the response multiple times when we might run the same prompt? So some of that is going to be, do we need the exact same sentence, the exact same wording in that sentence? Or do I need the concept of what that sentence is telling me? That's going to be an important determining factor. The other is formatting. So if I don't give it examples, I might have very different formatting. But in my prompt, I can give it formatting examples. Okay, 0 shot, few shot, many shot kind of examples in the prompt, so that if I'm generating an email, I may have a specific tone, a specific format, a specific cadence of the way that the email flows. And I can give those as examples so that when it spits out the response, it's following those examples. And so that helps me with that consistency. I'm never going to have 100% consistency. Yes.
That's only sort of true, right? So I'm asking from your experience, have you dialed it down to where you can get 100% consistency, right? The output of the softmax function at the end is a probability distribution. Given a prompt, the output of that probability distribution is fixed. It's sort of that final step where you're picking the words out. So have you ever dialed it down or looked at the probability distribution to stay consistent?
That is great. Okay, here's the question. He's sitting in the back of the room. He asked a great question. I don't know what he asked, but here's the answer. Okay, I'm going to paraphrase because there's no way I'm going to be able to say exactly what you said. Is there a process, or have you, in your experience, dialed it down so that you can get that deterministic response over and over and over as an output?
Correct.
Okay. In certain situations with very specific prompts, yes, you can. So if I know that I have something where I am looking for a specific fact, it gives me that fact back. If I'm doing a process where I'm explaining a math process and I'm looking for an answer back, I can get to that answer. Now, I've got to do some work sometimes to explain the process to get to that answer in my prompt, but I do get the answer back. where I have more free form, where I want it to generate, right? I'm asking it to generate copy. I'm asking it to generate email. Then I don't need to have that level of, I'll call it repeatability, but I still need the concept. I still need the flow. I still need that voice. Yes.
So I want to make one fact, that's like, the question, and I know you know this, but so, kind of leading you, the question I have is, LLMs are a choice for what I would say a certain type of response that you want to have. If you're looking for consistency, you have a lot of experience in the platform of machine learning and AI, where you're wrangling the data and creating, as I say, predictive models to create that consistency.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, and I don't know if they're deep to solve, but just wondering, do you need to know when to use which approach? You have a way of basically saying, that's, Steve, yes, when that's important, go to machine learning, do something. Yeah, do something else.
Yes.
I don't know if it's the right approach.
Well, I think it is. I think that part of it is, what's the use case we're trying to get to, or that we're trying to implement? What are we trying to get to? I think the other thing is that we have to make sure that we're not in a situation where we have a hammer and everything is a nail. Or that the business isn't driving us to say, we need that check mark. We are going to put AI into this application. Don't care what it is, don't care how it is, but you will put AI into this system. And now we're putting AI into the system where we're forcing it. And so part of it is picking the right tool for the right implementation. Yes.
Would you find value in going the federated approach, kind of get you in that line where you are getting some generative content, but it's boxed enough to where you get a little more for that 100%?
Okay, so the question was, if you go with the federated approach and you work on that, does that give you the ability to get to 100%? Kind of missed a couple words in there, but closer to 100%.
Basically just trying to shoehorn LLM stuff into an area where you should be going.
You will find out very, very quickly if you are shoehorning it in, because you are going to struggle and you are going to feel like you're fighting the system. If that is the case, you really do have to make sure you're looking at it. Why? What are we doing? Why is this what we're doing? If you are trying to do, well, I'll pick a customer. If I'm trying to write an auditing application and I'm doing a lot of accounting, I probably should not be using an LLM for my accounting. That just isn't right. Now, if I'm looking for certain activities, if I want it to summarize, if I want it to create the findings document, if I want it to generate different risks that I should be thinking about, okay, that's actually interesting, right? There's an interesting use case for having it generate output. And that's really what an LLM does. It's generating output for me. And so that's where this becomes kind of that, what's the right piece? Okay. So I'm going to put on my hat for a minute. I tend to like to do these without my Microsoft hat on. I will tell you that there is a tool that Microsoft has called PromptFlow that lets me create workflows, do my testing, prompt variants, all those kinds of things. If you're interested, look at it. If other companies have things like it, make sure you're looking at it. I don't care what tool, but tools exist, right? So I'll talk about a little bit of it here. The biggest reason that I talk about this, the 5 biggest reasons that I'm talking about this are because, number one, I can see everything graphically. And so what I mean by that is I can go and have an input. I can interact with my large language model. I can get a response out. Very, very basic, simple. But I can see it graphically. And now, as I'm trying to explain what this does, as I'm trying to show the business, as I'm trying to create the models, the diagrams, the documentation that we all do, right? Okay, good, good. Somebody said right. I get that as part of the tool. The other thing is that when we talked about all of the people that are going to be interacting with the system, how do I make sure that they all have the same vision, the same view of the solution? Well, if I can see it graphically, I can now start to talk about it. I can now start to say, wait, we missed this. Or what is this thing doing? So that's one aspect of it. The other is that now I know the entire end-to-end. I know what I'm interacting with. I know that I've got custom code that's calling out to something. I know that I'm calling out to whatever is doing our vectorizing, our chunking, our index creation, whatever it is. And now it's part of that. So now I can go capture all of that and put that into a deployment pipeline. I can now start to write tests against this. I can start to create prompt variants. And I can go test the different variances on a run and see which one gave me the better output. Now, better is, I'll say, a level of degrees, right? But if I know what I'm expecting to come out, part of the tooling of testing is that I can say, hey, you know what? This is what came out. This is what I was expecting. How close are we? Now give me statistics for which of those prompts did a better job getting me to what I wanted. And now I can go pick the right prompt. So that's why I'm talking about specifically a tool like this. So yes.
When you say statistics, are you measuring just similarity between outputs? Like how do you automate that?
So yes, it is similarities. You've got different models. Oh, the question. I'm going to struggle with that this entire time. Okay, so the question was, how do you validate the output against what you're expecting is essentially. And so is it similarity? Is it an exact match? It is similarity. It is not an exact match. And it will tell you that this one was this percent close to that output. And so you get some of those types of statistics. Okay, so the other reason, and again, this is about prompt flow, whatever tool you want to use. But what I would say is don't hand code something where there's a tool that already exists. Maybe augment it. But if the tool is there, there's going to be some benefits. Metrics, not just metrics after we deploy on how it's running, but metrics of how well is it running as I'm doing my testing and as I'm doing my development. It could be speed. It could be quality. It could be latency, right? Those are different things. The other is if I've got some of these, performance, accuracy, those types of things, how is that impacting my cost, right? The large language models are essentially priced based on tokens. The larger my prompt, the more expensive it is. So what happens if I shrink my prompts and I take data out of my prompts? Am I affecting my accuracy to get a better price? Is it better that I pay a little bit more to get better accuracy? Those are some of the trade-offs. I want to know that here before I package this up and get it into production. Okay, I'm going to skip some of this. The one thing that I do want to talk about is whatever tool you are using, make sure that it integrates with your code repository. Right? This is another tool that is part of our DevOps process. So whatever gets created, make sure that I can take those code artifacts, put them into my code repository, and I treat them just as I would any other piece of code. Right? So that becomes important. Okay, now the question is, and this is my question, is that the only way to do it, where I'm using something that is something like prompt flow or a graphic-based orchestrator? And the answer is no. There are some really nice things about it, but how many of us are using LangChain or semantic kernel? Okay, great. So I can do everything, the entire orchestration that I was just showing graphically, I can do that through code. And that works just fine too, right? It's just a matter of what am I used to? What do I know? What am I trying to do within the organization? If I want a graphical representation where I'm showing this and having that documentation for different types of users, that kind of graphic interface makes a lot of sense. It's harder to go show somebody what's happening in code. But yes, I can absolutely do all of that. The other is that I can take LangChain or semantic kernel and incorporate that in with a tool like PromptFlow. Doesn't have to be one or the other. Okay. So let's go on to ring 3. So ring 3 is now we have our system, we have our application. We're ready to package it. We're ready to deploy it. We're ready to create pipelines. We're ready to monitor it. Right? Those are all the things we're going to do there. Maybe some cost justification or cost modeling. Maybe, if your company is interested, maybe. Okay, so we've talked about all of these piece parts. So the first thing I have to do is I have to figure out, what did I actually do? What tools am I using? And again, this is an Azure example. Whether you're using Azure or not, there's going to be equivalents in other platforms. But all of these are going to be parts of that solution that I need to make sure that I am packaging. Because not only am I creating a pipeline to get us into production, right? We do need to do that. But the other part is that I'm going to repeat that pipeline. Because now I need to get us into each of the environments. Right? So I've done some work on my machine. And it always works on my machine, by the way. I don't care what solution. I know it works on my machine. So the issue is, how do I take it from my machine, do my pull requests, get it into my first environment, and then test that into whether it's dev, stage, pre-prod, whatever we want to call them, however many environments we have, and then finally into production. Right? That is the goal. Now, I'm going to bring us back to PromptFlow again, just as an example, because one of the things that PromptFlow lets me do is create the pipeline with everything that is within the purview of PromptFlow. So if I come back to this, whoops, did it too many times. If I come back to this, all of this, all the interactions would all be contained within that graphic representation, right? Everything that I'm doing with whatever plugins and whatever embedding model, whatever orchestration piece. And again, I might be using either one of those two just to generate plugins to that model. I may not necessarily create my entire end-to-end in LangChain or semantic kernel. So that's another architectural piece that becomes a trade-off. Is, am I doing this within something, a tool like PromptFlow, or am I doing it 100% code? Or am I using this to create plugins or agents where those agents or those plugins know how to connect to whatever system, a ticketing system, an accounting system, whatever that is. And then I create that. Or I need a human interaction. And so I'm going to use an agent framework. And then does that agent now know how to interact with the person? And again, whatever that mechanism is, wait for that response back and continue the flow. You had a question, yes.
Okay, the previous slide,
If I come back to this one,
is there something that Azure provides for monitorization of LLMs, like data for them? Because you can monitorize the whole ecosystem, but how LLMs are replying back to your products, that's tricky.
so have you seen, did you get previews of my slide deck? Because you are one slide away. That is perfect. Let's go right into that. Because it's about monitoring and observability. And I know that we are getting a little bit close to the end time. But we still have a couple hours, right? We still have to go get beers and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, so your question, does Azure provide monitoring capabilities, monitoring of the LLMs, monitoring of the interactions? The answer is yes. There's a couple different ways that that gets done. And it depends on where it gets done, whether it's the development interactions, if it's in production. It also depends on what we're trying to monitor. So what I mean by that is earlier when I said all of the data that you use to interact with the large language model is yours, right? So that prompt, Microsoft doesn't collect it. The response, Microsoft doesn't collect it. And you cannot see it within the monitoring tools, right? Because we're not collecting it. And so because we don't collect it, we can't show it to you in the monitoring. We can show you all kinds of other things that is statistics and whatever else. If you need to be able to get the prompt and the response, then you use something like an API manager tool, and you use the wiretap pattern to be able to look at the prompt and the response body and grab those and store those. Okay, but then that's something you're doing, and then you're looking at that and analyzing that. But all of these things, we want to make sure that we are monitoring. And whether it is the type of response that we're getting back, whether, and what I mean by that is the response based on what your expectations are versus what you got. Are you getting hallucinations? Are there other things that are happening within your environment that you want to make sure that you're getting? Now, the other piece, and I'm going to build this out too, is that there's a lot of things that we want to make sure that we're looking at as we monitor. Where am I getting my data? I think I've said that 4 times in this presentation. And I'm saying it specifically because I need to monitor what's happening with that. Is that data the right data? Is it the same data when I went into production? Am I getting new data in every day? Do I know what data I'm bringing in to my data set? Okay, those are things that happen, right? Whether it's feature drift, data quality, et cetera. What's happening as I try to explain what's happening in my model? As I look at, am I getting errors? How many of these am I doing a minute, a second, a day, whatever that looks like? How many tokens have I used? How many tokens am I using in a day? How many am I using in a month? Do I have some type of a up and down? Do I have a busy season? What does that mean? What does that look like? Am I doing show back or charge back of any of that data or any of that charge? Who's paying for it? Is central IT paying for it? Is the business paying for it? Do I have different teams that I need to show them how much they're actually using out of the pool? And do they care because they're not being charged? Am I doing charge back where now they care because they are being charged? Right? I'm monitoring that data. The other piece when we get into observability is what comes out of the system. I need to make sure that, I've talked about token usage. I need to make sure that I've got quality, content safety. I talked about filtering. There's other tools that let us do content safety. And I can set slider bars that tell me how much in a category do I want higher safety, lower safety. If I'm in an environment that might be healthcare and I'm using specific words that would get caught, I might want to slide those down. Right? So those are some of the things that we want to make sure that is part of the system, part of the solution, but also how are we using it? So these are going to be things that become important as we think about what do we monitor, what are the things that are those aspects once we get into production. I talked about content safety real quickly, but this is what I was talking about, where we can configure for violent self-harm, sexual content, or hate. It's very effective. And depending on whether you are sliding up or down, you have control over it. Once we build the system, we get it into place, we have to keep one thing in mind throughout the entire process. And that entire process is about responsible AI. It is our job to make sure that we are being responsible with this. We understand how it's going to be used. We understand our users and what our users are going to be doing or what we want for our users. We have to make sure that we are providing something that's safe. The output is safe. That the business is still safe. We have to make sure that it is transparent, that we can see exactly what's happening at every single step. And whether that's logging data, monitoring data, whatever that is, we need to be able to go in and make sure that we understand and can explain at each step what happened, what were we expecting, is this different than what we were expecting? And all of that happens throughout the entire process. And at this point, we now have a solution in production. So congratulations, everybody. I will open it up for Q&A. That was fast. You had your hand up first.
Could you offer how do you detect hallucinations or private data leakage in a production environment? What do you do to instrument that?
Okay. So how do you detect or instrument or monitor for hallucinations or data leakage?
Yeah.
Okay. I told you by the time I finished the presentation, I'd be able to repeat these back to the people online. Okay, so hallucinations. With hallucinations, part of it is going to come down to testing. What is the expected output? And what is the actual output and how similar are they? The other thing that I would say is you always want always want somebody reviewing what gets generated from a large language model. Don't just take the output, put it in a JSON format, shove it into a database and use it for whatever comes downstream. So in the sense of hallucinations, yes, I can do some automation around the testing. Yes, I can try to get close to, detecting. But I still need somebody to validate and to make sure, to get to that 100% level. In terms of data leakage, there's a couple different things. You've got data leakage with the LLM itself. So make sure that whatever LLM you use, you interact with, make sure you understand what it is that they are providing and what they're collecting. There are some companies that are out there that say we will not include your data in the training, but we will use it for testing. Is that okay or not? And again, it's not a judgment. It's not a yes or no. It's what is acceptable for your company, your use case, your data. For the majority of the customers that I work with, that becomes a really big issue. And they want to know that there is something in writing publicly available that says, we're not using your data, we're not training, testing, tuning, whatever else. So that's one level of data leakage. The other part of data leakage is, let's say I'm using the RAG pattern and I now have data that I've incorporated into my solution. Okay, well, that data is going to be part of the response that I get back. So who is this application really for? Is this internally for employees? In that case, I don't care that that data is part of my response. Is this for public consumption? Maybe in that case, I do care. And maybe I have two different versions. I have one customer that takes all of their industry acronyms. And that is what they use for their RAG data. It's the acronyms, it's what it means, and it's a public-facing application. So questions that come up, large language model is not going to know any of those acronyms, not going to know any of that information. And for them, they don't care that that gets out there. They want it to get out there, right? Those are the industry acronyms. And it makes it so that the answers that they're getting back are better. And so very different use cases. Other questions? Yes.
You'd be sharing the slide deck.
I'm happy to share the slide deck. I saw lots of people taking pictures, but I'm happy to share. Other questions? Okay, I have questions for you. So, two questions. One, how many of you are already doing the things that I've talked about? Okay, I like that. Completely end to end? Okay. How many have heard of prompt flow? Okay.
Say that again, prompt what?
Prompt flow. How many have used another version of that on a different platform? Okay, because again, to me, I want to make sure that people are using tools that are there. Whether you use the one that's on the platform that, for my company, I don't care. I care, but I don't care. Yes, exactly. So prompt flow is that graphical representation of the workflow. Now, okay.
That's the problem with the multiple models.
Yes.
And then there's another
another shift Oyen has predictive human reference model for ranking as well. And again, I'm not using those, but I want to learn more about it. I was doing that one. Wow.
Yep. The other part that, so I said prompt flow does the graphic representation. But the other part that I talked about in the presentation was also the ability to do prompt variants. How do I know which prompt is actually getting me the response back? How do I get the statistics about that? How do I do my testing so that I can compare it against what my expectations are? How do I package everything and create those pipelines? Right? So there's a lot of pieces that go with that full end-to-end. For me, anything that makes my life easier, faster, cheaper, I'm interested in. Right? So for me, prompt flow, I looked at it, and again, whatever tool, and it just made sense. I didn't want to have to write it myself. I didn't want to have to debug it. Yes, somebody who's done a lot of debugging.
Yes.
So that's why I wanted to make sure that I talked a little bit about, again, whether it is that tool or another tool that does it, but making sure that we know that those tools exist. Yes.
Like, we version our code and we version, but like, how do you feel? You started the talk with DevOps
Yes.
and packaging, you bring up packaging over and over. What are your thoughts on like packaging our data, like snapshotting, we're putting data into our RAG system, moving that Friday to Thursday, Friday to Monday, like where do we draw the line? Sometimes we're just update, throw a few records in, pull a few out, and maybe blow in the whole thing.
Yes. So part of that comes back to what is the versioning strategy? And am I rebuilding my indexes? And again, am I creating embeddings? Am I creating a vector database, a vector index? So those are going to be a little bit different. How often does my data change? And do I need immediate updates? Do I need nightly updates? Okay, so one of my customers is doing something where I kind of talked about this a little bit, where they're creating vector indexes. They've got a primary that they use during the day. The secondary is being updated, and then at midnight, they swap them. And then the secondary becomes the primary for the next day. And then I start building that secondary index. So that's a pattern that you can do if I need to make sure that I'm constantly keeping that data up to date. The other is, what am I doing at, am I keeping track of what's happening at the database level? So how do I know where that versioning is taking place, or what records are changed? What records do I need to go capture? Is my data that I'm using structured data or unstructured data? If it's unstructured data, am I chunking that data and creating the embeddings every time that a PDF changes or a document changes or whatever it is? Or am I taking that over time? Or am I doing this, and again, I'm going to kind of come back to an example of, do we take company 10Ks? And so am I doing that based on a quarterly cycle so that I always have those captured to be able to ask questions of that kind of data? So a lot of it's going to depend on what form the data is in, what frequency do I need that data, but then how do I make sure that I mark it, and whether I just go get every single file in that directory that started on this date and everything newer, or do I have stuff that's in a database and I now need to keep flags about this changed, and then I need to make sure I capture it and change that flag. So part of that has to be part of the solution. Yes.
So curiosity, like you just described, the rebuilding indexes and this and that. There's that element of, is your customer trusted? Because you're like, well, now you can't duplicate what I saw. I'm like, the data, we did this. It's the rebuild of the indexes can make a huge difference. So like in your role at Microsoft, how have you tried to really get that customer trust, but also that helping them as an organization understand things will move?
Yes.
Because that, I think, is one of the hardest hurdles to sell the product.
Okay, so the question was, if you're rebuilding the indexes, how do you make sure that there's still trust? And if I query something today or right now, and I do it again, and that data changes, how do I know which one to trust? So the example that I was giving about the primary and secondary, their solution is that they did that swap over at night. So during a day, you would always get the same, essentially the same answer, right? That index was always the same for the day. The next day, it might change, but it was changing because that data had been updated. And so then whatever you got on that day was now the new right answer. Now, you still have to make sure that where are we getting our data from? Was that the right data? Has that data been validated before it went into the process to do the chunking and the embedding and everything else? Again, depending on the solution, that might be an easier thing for unstructured data than for data that's in a database. It depends. So a lot of it is going to come out to what are the decisions that you're being asked to make within the solution? What's the use case? Are we in a regulated environment? If we're in a regulated environment, I might not be able to do it that way. So it depends. But that is an important aspect. I can go create the best application in the world, and if the end users don't trust it, then it's useless. They're not going to use it. Right? And that's the same with any application that we've ever built. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up on this specific situation where you're talking
Yeah.
about the promotion of the secondary index? Should we be assuming that before that happens, it's all taking place in a testing environment first as well? That they can
Yes.
a secondary index that's prod-like or as close as possible?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what they do is they've got automated tests, and they're looking for things that are anomalies or things that are outside of whatever range. But yes, it absolutely needs to be tested.
So back to the customer trust. With reference that workflow and we reference the battery of tests that are
Yes.
about insurance.
Yep. Now, the same thing happens. Did I write the right tests? Did I write the right number of tests? And did I have the right coverage? Those are still the same things we're gonna grapple with, no matter whether it's this solution or any other solution. I think
we're out of time.
oh, we're way beyond time.
You want us to be done at 6, right?
Yes.
All right. A question on testing output from prompts. The automated test tools I'm familiar with can search/validate on exact matches with actual versus expected. But with LLMs, the output may change slightly using this preferred but similar needs. Any ideas on what tools are good at comparing sentiment and validating at that level?
Yes. Use prompt flow. So right.
Yeah, and I can put a link out somewhere.
I will drop it here in the Zoom chat for folks to be able to comment on the meetup page for this event. So you here in the room and the folks here on Zoom, it's about the great content.
But Steve, what you're saying makes a lot of sense in that when you're running these, you need to validate it, but still, if you're ever gonna get 100% without most computers there, and he was still fallible too.
Yep.
But I think what we're looking at that convergence of accuracy, and that's really visually or not visually, we want that.
Okay, now, I know we might have time. I'm willing to stick around and I could use a beer, so I'm gonna head down there anyways to buy one, but I'm happy to have more conversations and it's a fun topic.
Thanks for coming. Wow. this is very-
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thanks, folks.
And thank you to everybody online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fantastic.
It's interesting. Same question. Yes. So it's an interesting.
All right, guys. Have a good night. I'm going to disconnect.